The water was so cold it felt like 1,000 knives cutting into his skin all
Steady
at
now. Lift
once.
on three.
Werner Hoffmann
Ready?
was
One, two,
drowning.
three. Good.
23
Pushing in.
years old,
Ready.
from
Hands.
Hamburg,
Right.
son of a
Securing the line.
shipbuilder,
Check the
brother
prop.
to a
We're pushing off.
17-year-old girl named Elsa, who still wrote him letters every week asking when he would come home. And now he was going to die in the middle of the North Atlantic, surrounded by nothing but darkness and the screaming of men who would never see their families again. Above him, circling like a patient vulture waiting for its meal, was the aircraft that had just destroyed everything he knew. The British called it the Sunderland. The Germans had another name for it. They called it the Fliegende Stachelschwein, the flying porcupine. And Werner had spent the last 8 months learning to fear that name more than any other sound in the English language. But what happened in the next 48 hours would shatter every belief the Nazi regime had ever taught him about his enemies. This is not a story about a war machine. This is not a story about bombs and bullets and military strategy. This is a story about a cup of tea, a bacon sandwich, and the moment when a young German sailor discovered that everything he had been told about Americans and British people was a lie. Let us go back to the beginning. The year was 1943, and the Battle of the Atlantic was reaching its most desperate hour. For 4 years, German U-boats had been strangling the life out of Great Britain. Every week, dozens of merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and weapons from America were sent to the bottom of the ocean. Millions of tons of supplies that could have fed families, powered factories, and armed soldiers instead lay scattered across the Atlantic floor, guarded only by the bodies of the sailors who had tried to deliver them. Winston Churchill would later say that the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat threat, and he was right to be afraid. By the spring of 1943, Germany was winning the Battle of the Atlantic. The wolf packs, as Admiral Karl Dönitz called his submarine fleets, were hunting with terrifying efficiency. For every U-boat, the Allies managed to sink 3 more rolled off the assembly lines in Hamburg, Bremen, and Kiel. But there was a price for this success, a price that the German propaganda machine never talked about. The men who served on U-boats had the highest casualty rate of any branch of the German military, higher than the infantry fighting in Russia, higher than the Luftwaffe pilots dueling Spitfires over England, higher than the Panzer crews burning in North Africa. 75%. That was the number that every U-boat sailor knew but never spoke aloud. 3 out of every 4 men who went to sea in a German submarine would never come home. They would die in the cold, in the dark, crushed by water pressure, or burned by their own fuel, or simply drowned when their boats went down and the hatches refused to open. Werner Hoffmann knew this number. He had seen it proven true with his own eyes. He had joined the Kriegsmarine in the summer of 1942, just after his 22nd birthday. His father had wanted him to stay in Hamburg and continue the family tradition of building ships rather than sailing them. But Werner had believed in something larger than himself. He had believed in Germany, in the fatherland, in the destiny that the Führer promised to all young German men who were willing to fight for it. The propaganda had been effective. Werner had grown up watching newsreels that showed German soldiers as heroes, liberators, defenders of civilization against the barbaric hordes of the East and the decadent democracies of the West. He had been taught that the British were cold-blooded imperialists who had starved millions in India and Africa. He had been taught that the Americans were mongrels, a nation of gangsters and Jews who cared only about money. These were not unusual beliefs for a young German man in 1942. They were simply the water he had been swimming in his entire life. He had never questioned them any more than he questioned why the sky was blue or why the sun rose in the east. So when the recruiters came to Hamburg looking for young men with technical skills to serve on the new generation of U-boats, Werner had volunteered without hesitation. His father had wept. His sister Elsa had clung to him at the train station, begging him not to go. But Werner had been certain that he was doing the right thing. He would learn the truth soon enough. U-boat training was brutal, designed to break weak men and forge the survivors into something harder than steel. Werner spent 3 months learning every system on a Type 7 submarine. The diesel engines that powered the boat on the surface, the electric motors that drove it underwater, the torpedo tubes and the complex mechanisms that aimed them. And most importantly for Werner, the hydrophone and radar detection equipment that served as the boat's ears in a world where sound traveled farther and faster than light. He had a talent for this work. His instructors noticed that he could hear things in the static and the noise that other men missed. Distant propellers, the ping of enemy sonar, the faint hum of an aircraft engine carried across the water. They made him a funkmot, a radio and detection specialist, and assigned him to U-467 under the command of Kapitän-Leutnant Friedrich Brandt. Werner reported for duty in January of 1943. He was eager, patriotic, and absolutely certain that he would help win the war. Within 3 weeks, 2 of his classmates from training were dead. U-551 was depth-charged off the coast of Ireland. All hands lost. U-623 was caught on the surface by a British aircraft and sunk with gunfire. 47 men killed. Only 3 survivors. Werner attended the memorial service in the chapel at Lorient, the great U-boat base on the French coast. He stood in the back row and watched the empty chairs lined up in front of the altar, each one representing a man he had known, had trained with, had shared meals and jokes and fears with. When he walked out of that chapel, something had changed inside him. Not his loyalty, not his beliefs, but something deeper and harder to name. A small voice in the back of his mind that whispered, perhaps this is not what they promised it would be. He ignored that voice. He had to. There was a war to fight. Life on a U-boat was unlike anything Werner had ever experienced. The submarine was not designed for human comfort. It was designed to kill, and the 52 men who lived inside its steel hull were merely the biological components necessary to make it function. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, sweat, mold, and the ever-present stench of the single toilet that served the entire crew. Fresh water was rationed so strictly that the men went weeks without bathing. Food started as reasonable provisions and gradually deteriorated into a grim selection of canned meat, stale bread, and whatever vegetables had not yet rotted in the damp. Sleeping quarters were shared in rotation. Hot bunking, they called it. When one man finished his watch and collapsed into a bunk, the sheets were still warm from the body of the sailor who had just left to take his place. Privacy did not exist. Personal space did not exist. The men lived in each other's pockets, breathing each other's air, listening to each other's nightmares. And always, always there was the fear. On the surface, a U-boat was vulnerable to aircraft. The Allies had developed long-range patrol planes that could spot a submarine from miles away and attack before the crew even knew they were in danger. So the boats spent most of their time submerged, hiding beneath the waves, conserving battery power, and waiting for the right moment to strike. But submarines were never designed to stay underwater indefinitely. The diesel engines needed air to run, and the batteries needed to be recharged after every few hours of submerged operation. So every night the U-boats had to surface, exposing themselves to whatever eyes might be watching from above. This was when men died, in the darkness, in the few precious hours when they thought they were safe. Werner learned to sleep in fits and starts, always listening for the alarm that would send them crashing down into the depths. He learned to eat quickly because a meal could be interrupted at any moment. He learned to move through the cramped passageways without thinking, his body memorizing the location of every pipe and valve and hatch. And he learned to listen. That was his job, to sit at his station with headphones clamped over his ears, monitoring the hydrophone and the METOX receiver, searching for any sign of danger. The hydrophone picked up sounds traveling through the water, propellers from surface ships, the distinctive whine of destroyer engines, the terrifying ping of active sonar searching for their location. The METOX was something newer, something that gave the U-boat men hope. The British had developed airborne radar. This was no secret. German intelligence had known about it since 1941. Aircraft equipped with ASV radar could detect a surface submarine from several miles away, giving them enough time to swoop in for an attack before the U-boat could dive to safety. For months, this technology had been slaughtering German submarines. Boats that thought they were safe under cover of darkness were suddenly caught in the glare of searchlights, hammered with bombs and depth charges before they even knew what was happening. But German engineers had found a countermeasure. The METOX receiver could detect the radar emissions from British aircraft. When an enemy plane turned on its ASV radar to search for submarines, the METOX would pick up the signal and alert the U-boat crew. As long as the boat dove before the aircraft got too close, they would be safe. Or so they believed. Werner remembered the day the METOX arrived on U-467. The crew had celebrated like men who had just been handed a miracle. Kapitän-Leutnant Brandt had smiled a rare expression on his usually grim face and told them that the days of being hunted were over. Now they would do the hunting. For 3 months, the METOX worked exactly as promised. Twice Werner detected radar signals while on watch and alerted the bridge. Both times U-467 dove in time, slipping beneath the waves seconds before British aircraft arrived at their position. Both times the crew clapped Werner on the back and praised his sharp ears. He began to feel something he had not felt since those early days of training. Confidence. Perhaps even pride. The propaganda was right. German engineering was superior. German discipline was unmatched. The fatherland would prevail. In May of 1943, U-467 sank two Allied merchant ships in the span of a single week. Werner listened through his headphones as the torpedoes struck home. He heard the distant rumble of explosions, the screech of tearing metal, the hiss of water flooding into broken hulls. And then, faintly carried across the miles by the strange acoustics of the ocean, he heard something else. Voices. Men screaming for help, crying out in English as they splashed in the freezing water, surrounded by burning oil and sinking wreckage. Werner had torn off his headphones. He could not listen anymore. That night, lying in his bunk, he thought about those voices. He wondered who those men were, whether they had families waiting for them, whether their mothers would receive telegrams in a few weeks informing them that their sons were never coming home. He told himself that this was war. He told himself that those men were the enemy, that they would have done the same to him if their positions were reversed. He told himself that he was fighting for Germany, for his father and his sister and all the people he loved. But the voices stayed with him. They would stay with him for the rest of his life. The night of June 2nd, 1943 began like any other. U-467 had been submerged all day, running slowly on electric motors to conserve battery power. At sunset, Kapitän-Leutnant Brandt gave the order to surface. The diesels coughed to life, pumping fresh air into the stale interior and recharging the depleted batteries. Werner took his position at the Mittwoch's receiver. The green glow of the screen illuminated his face as he stared at the display, watching for any sign of enemy radar. Nothing. The screen was clear. Above him, through the open hatch, he could hear the watch crew taking their positions on the bridge. The night was calm. Stars filled the sky from horizon to horizon, undimmed by any moon. The only sound was the rumble of the diesels and the gentle splash of waves against the hull. Werner allowed himself to relax just a little. Nights like this were rare, peaceful, almost beautiful if you could forget where you were and what you were doing. At 2200 hours, he was relieved from his post. Another sailor took his place at the Mittwochs, while Werner climbed the ladder to the bridge for some fresh air. The wind was cold but clean, carrying none of the foul smells that saturated the interior of the boat. Werner leaned against the conning tower and looked up at the stars. He tried to remember the last time he had seen his sister, the last time he had eaten a home-cooked meal, the last time he had felt truly safe. He was still thinking about these things when the world exploded into light. The searchlight hit them without warning. One moment there was only darkness and stars. The next, a beam of brilliant white light pinned U-467 to the surface of the ocean like a specimen on a collector's board. Werner threw up his arm to shield his eyes. For a fraction of a second, he was completely blind, his night vision destroyed by the sudden glare. Then he heard the engines. 4 of them. Massive radial engines, the kind that powered large aircraft. Coming in fast from the northeast, already so close that the roar drowned out the shouting of the men around him. Someone was screaming a single word over and over again. Sunderland, Sunderland, Sunderland. Werner's blood turned to ice. The Sunderland was not just any aircraft. It was the largest flying boat in the Royal Air Force, a 4-engine monster with a wingspan of over 100 feet. It could stay airborne for more than 11 hours, patrolling thousands of square miles of ocean in a single mission. It carried bombs, depth charges, and enough machine guns to turn a surface submarine into a floating coffin. But what made it truly terrifying was what the Germans could not see. The latest Sunderlands carried a new type of radar. ASV Mark III, the British called it. Unlike the older versions, this radar operated on a completely different wavelength. The Mittwochs receivers could not detect it. To the German warning equipment, these aircraft were invisible. Werner did not know any of this. All he knew was that the Mittwochs had shown nothing. No warning, no signal. And now a flying porcupine was diving toward them out of the darkness, and there was no time to do anything but die. Kapitän-Leutnant Brandt reacted with the speed of a man who had survived 3 years of submarine warfare. Dive. Emergency dive. All hands below. The alarm shrieked through the boat. Men scrambled for hatches, abandoning the bridge, racing to their stations. The bow began to tilt downward as the ballast tanks flooded, dragging U-467 beneath the waves. But it was too late. The Sunderland released its bombs at an altitude of 50 feet. 4 weapons each weighing 250 pounds, packed with a new explosive called Torpex that was far more powerful than the standard TNT. The first bomb struck the water 10 meters from the U-boat's stern. The second hit even closer. The third and fourth bracketed the conning tower like the fists of an angry god. Werner was still on the ladder when the shockwave hit. The force threw him backwards, slamming him against a bulkhead with enough impact to crack ribs. The lights went out. Emergency lamps flickered on, painting everything in a dim red glow that made the chaos look like something from a nightmare. Water was coming in. He could hear it, a terrible rushing sound that grew louder with every heartbeat. Men were screaming. Someone was praying in a voice that cracked with terror. And then, with a groan of tortured metal, 467 began to die. The submarine rolled to starboard, throwing Werner against a mass of pipes and valves. Something sharp cut his forehead, sending blood streaming into his eyes. He wiped at it frantically, trying to understand what was happening. The boat was sinking. That much was certain. The angle was increasing, the bow pointing down toward the abyss. Water was everywhere now, pouring through cracks in the hull, flooding compartments faster than the pumps could handle. Werner pulled himself along the passageway, moving by instinct toward the forward torpedo room. There was an escape hatch there. If he could reach it, if the pressure had not already jammed it shut, he might have a chance. Behind him, he could hear Kapitän-Leutnant Brandt giving orders. Calm, controlled the voice of a man who knew he was about to do and refused to let his crew see his fear. Seal the aft compartments. Everyone forward. Prepare to abandon ship. But there was no abandoning a submarine at depth. They all knew that. The boat was too far down now, the pressure too great. The hatches would not open. The men in the engine room were already dead drowned or crushed when the hull finally gave way. Werner kept moving. He did not think about the men behind him. He did not think about anything except the next handhold, the next step, the next breath of air that might be his last. The water reached his waist, his chest, his chin. He took one final gulp of air and pulled himself through the hatch into the torpedo room, where 3 other men were already struggling with the emergency release. And then, impossibly miraculously, the hatch opened. Werner did not remember the ascent. Later, they told him that he had shot toward the surface like a cork from a champagne bottle, propelled by the last pocket of air escaping from the dying submarine. They told him that he had been unconscious when he hit the surface, that only pure luck had kept his face above water long enough for him to start breathing again. What he remembered was the cold. The North Atlantic in June was not warm. The water temperature was perhaps 10 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill an unprotected man in less than an hour. Werner's body began shutting down almost immediately, his muscles cramping, his thoughts growing sluggish and confused. He was floating in a sea of debris, oil slicks, broken equipment, things he did not want to look at too closely. Around him, scattered across the waves, were the other survivors. He could hear them calling to each other, voices weak and desperate. He tried to count them, but his mind would not cooperate. There had been 52 men on U-467. Now there were, how many 11-12 above the Sunderland was circling. Werner watched it through eyes that barely functioned. The great aircraft banked slowly, its navigation lights winking against the stars. It had killed his boat, killed his comrades, and now it was watching them drown. He thought about his sister Elsa, about the letter she would never receive, about the telegram that would arrive at his father's house in Hamburg, informing them that their son was lost at sea. He was ready to die, but the flying porcupine had other plans. The Sunderland began to descend. Werner watched in confusion as the massive aircraft dropped lower and lower, its landing lights blazing to life, its hull settling toward the waves. For a moment, he thought it was crashing. Then he realized the truth. It was landing. Landing on the open ocean in the middle of the night to rescue the survivors of a submarine it had just destroyed. This made no sense. These were the enemy, the barbaric British who bombed cities and starved colonies and cared nothing for human life. They should be flying away, leaving the German sailors to die in the cold. That was what Werner had been taught. That was what he believed. But the Sunderland touched down on the water with surprising grace, sending up plumes of spray that sparkled in the light from its own lamps. Its engines throttled back to idle, and it began to taxi slowly toward the survivors, a rescue vessel made of aluminum and courage. Someone threw a rope. Werner grabbed it without thinking, his hands so numb he could barely feel the fibers. He was pulled through the water, hauled alongside the aircraft's hull, and then strong arms were reaching down, lifting him up, dragging him through a hatch into the interior of the flying porcupine. He collapsed on the metal floor, shaking so violently that his teeth chattered. Water poured off him in streams. He could not see, could not think, could barely breathe. And then someone draped a blanket over his shoulders. Werner looked up. A British airman was kneeling beside him. Young, perhaps 25 or 26, sandy hair, freckles across his nose, blue eyes that held no hatred, no triumph, nothing but simple human concern. The airman said something in English. Werner did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. Gentle, reassuring, the way you might speak to a frightened child. Another man appeared with a steaming cup, tea. They were giving him tea. Werner wrapped his frozen hands around the cup and felt warmth spreading through his fingers for the first time in what seemed like hours. The heat was so intense it almost hurt, but he did not let go. He could not. He looked around the interior of the aircraft. It was larger than he had imagined, with enough space for the rescued German sailors to sit or lie on the deck. The British crew moved among them, distributing blankets and hot drinks, checking for injuries, speaking in voices that were calm and professional. These were the men who had just killed 40 of his comrades, and now they were saving his life. Werner did not know how long he sat there, clutching his tea, staring at nothing. His mind refused to process what was happening. The propaganda, the training, the beliefs he had held since childhood, they were all colliding with a reality that did not fit. Then someone sat down beside him. It was one of the aircraft's gunners. An older man, perhaps 35, with the weathered face of someone who had seen too much. He held out something wrapped in waxed paper. A sandwich. Werner took it with trembling hands. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing 2 slices of white bread with thick strips of bacon between them. The smell hit him like a physical force, rich and smoky, and unbearably delicious after months of submarine rations. The gunner nodded at him. "Eat," he said. The word needed no translation. Werner bit into the sandwich. The bacon was crispy and salty, the bread soft, the butter rich. It was the most wonderful thing he had ever tasted. Tears began streaming down his face, mixing with the seawater that still dripped from his hair. He was crying over a bacon sandwich, but he was not really crying about the food. He was crying because everything he thought he knew about the world had just been proven wrong. The enemy was not a monster. The enemy was a man who sat beside you and shared his food and asked nothing in return. Werner looked at the gunner through his tears. "Thank you," he whispered in German, the only words he could find. The gunner seemed to understand. He put a hand on Werner's shoulder and squeezed gently. Then he stood up and went back to his duties, leaving Werner alone with his blanket and his tea and the remains of a bacon sandwich that had just changed his life forever. The Sunderland flew through the night, carrying 11 German survivors toward an uncertain future. Werner did not know where they were going. He did not know what would happen when they arrived. He only knew that he was alive and that the men who had saved him were not what he had been told they would be. He thought about the voices he had heard through his headphones, the British sailors crying for help in the water, the men his submarine had left to die. Would those men have been saved if the situations were reversed? He did not know. He hoped so, but he was no longer certain of anything. The aircraft's engines droned steadily, a sound that had once meant death and now meant survival. Werner closed his eyes and let himself drift, exhausted beyond measure, his frozen body slowly thawing in the warmth of the cabin. Somewhere over the horizon, a new day was beginning, and Werner Hoffmann's old life was ending. Everything that came next would be different. Dawn came slowly over the coast of Cornwall. Werner watched through one of the Sunderland's small windows as the gray waters of the Atlantic gave way to something he had not seen in nearly 6 months. Land. Green hills rising from the morning mist. Stone cottages with smoke curling from their chimneys. A world that seemed impossibly peaceful after the violence of the night before. The aircraft descended toward a protected bay, its hull kissing the water with a gentle spray that caught the early sunlight and turned it into diamonds. Werner felt the change in motion as the flying boat settled onto the surface and began taxiing toward a concrete jetty where trucks and armed soldiers were already waiting. This was England, enemy territory, the place he had been trained to hate and taught to destroy, and yet the first thing he noticed was how beautiful it was. The next few hours passed in a blur of confusion and exhaustion. Werner and the other survivors were helped off the aircraft and onto the jetty, where British military police took custody of them. There was no roughness, no shouting, no violence. The guards simply directed them toward the waiting trucks with gestures and occasional words in broken German. A medical officer examined each prisoner, checking for injuries and signs of hypothermia. Werner's cracked ribs were wrapped in bandages. The cut on his forehead was cleaned and stitched. Someone gave him dry clothes to replace his sodden uniform. Someone else handed him another cup of tea. Always the tea. The British and their endless tea. Werner accepted it gratefully. The warmth was still spreading through his body, chasing away the last of the cold that had settled into his bones during those terrible minutes in the water. He wrapped his hands around the cup and watched the steam rise, trying to make sense of what was happening. He was a prisoner of war now. His fighting days were over. Whatever came next, he would face it not as a sailor of the Kriegsmarine, but as a captive dependent on the mercy of men he had been taught to consider monsters. But so far, the monsters had given him blankets and bandages and bacon sandwiches. The monsters had pulled him from the freezing ocean and treated his wounds and spoken to him with kindness. Nothing made sense anymore. They were taken to a processing center somewhere in the English countryside. Werner never learned the name of the place. It was simply a collection of wooden buildings surrounded by barbed wire, staffed by tired-looking soldiers who processed prisoners with the mechanical efficiency of men who had done this work 1,000 times before. He was photographed, fingerprinted, interrogated by an officer who spoke perfect German with a Berlin accent and asked questions about U-boat operations, patrol routes, and communication codes. Werner answered truthfully when the questions were harmless and claimed ignorance when they were not. The officer did not seem surprised or disappointed by this. He simply made notes in a file and moved on to the next prisoner. Then came the waiting. Days passed, perhaps a week. Werner lost track of time in the monotony of the camp. He slept in a barracks with other German prisoners, ate meals that were plain but adequate, and spent his hours staring at the sky and wondering what would happen next. The other survivors from U-467 were scattered throughout the camp. Werner saw them occasionally, nodded to them across the yard, but they did not speak much. There was nothing to say. They had all lost friends in the attack. They had all been saved by the same enemy aircraft. They were all trying to understand what that meant. One evening, a guard told them to pack their belongings. They were being transferred to America. The ship that carried them across the Atlantic was a Liberty-class cargo vessel, one of thousands that the United States was producing at an almost miraculous rate. Werner had spent months trying to sink ships exactly like this one. Now he was a passenger locked in a converted cargo hold with 200 other German prisoners, sailing toward a continent he had never seen and could barely imagine. The voyage took 12 days. 12 days of rolling seas and cramped quarters and the constant fear that a U-boat might find them and send them all to the bottom. The irony was not lost on Werner. He lay in his bunk at night and listened to the ship's engines and thought about how strange fate could be. The food on the transport was better than anything he had eaten in months. Fresh bread, real butter, meat that did not come from a can. The prisoners looked at each other in disbelief as they filed through the mess line, accepting portions that seemed impossibly generous. "This is a trick," one man muttered. "They are fattening us up before the labor camps." Werner said nothing. He was no longer certain what was true and what was propaganda. The only thing he knew for certain was that his stomach was full and his body was healing, and no one had beaten him or starved him or treated him with anything other than professional indifference. Perhaps that was enough for now. They landed in Norfolk, Virginia on a morning in late June. Werner's first impression of America was the heat. It struck him like a physical force as he stepped off the ship, a wall of humid air that made his German wool uniform feel like a torture device. Within minutes, he was drenched in sweat, squinting against a sun that seemed far too bright and far too close. His second impression was the size of everything. The harbor was enormous, filled with ships of every description. Cranes towered overhead, loading and unloading cargo with mechanical precision. Trucks rumbled past in endless convoys carrying supplies to destinations Werner could not begin to guess. And beyond the harbor, stretching toward a horizon that seemed impossibly distant, was a city larger than any he had ever seen. This was the nation that Germany was fighting. This industrial giant that could build ships faster than U-boats, could sink them, that could feed its enemies even while waging war on two fronts, that seemed to have resources without limit and power without end. For the first time, Werner began to understand why his father had wept when he left for the Navy. Another train, another journey, another step deeper into the heart of enemy territory. The prisoners were loaded into passenger cars, not cattle wagons. The windows were open to let in the breeze, and armed guards sat at either end of each car, looking bored and uncomfortable in the summer heat. No one tried to escape. There was nowhere to go. Werner watched America roll past his window and felt his understanding of the world crack a little more with every mile. The farms were vast, stretching to the horizon in neat rows of green and gold. Cattle grazed in fields so large that Werner could not see where they ended. Small towns appeared and disappeared, each one looking prosperous and undamaged, untouched by the bombs that had leveled so much of Europe. There was no rubble here, no rationing lines, no hollow-eyed children searching through garbage for food. America was not suffering. America was thriving. And Werner began to realize with a cold certainty that settled into his stomach like a stone that Germany was going to lose this war. The train brought them to Texas. Werner had heard of Texas. Everyone had heard of Texas. It was the place of cowboys and Indians, of vast deserts and lawless frontiers, of men who wore wide-brimmed hats and carried revolvers on their hips. The movies he had watched as a child had shown Texas as a wild and dangerous land populated by rough men who solved their problems with violence. What he found was something different. The prisoner of war camp was located near a small town whose name Werner could never quite pronounce correctly. It consisted of several dozen wooden barracks, surrounded by wire fencing set in the middle of flat agricultural land that stretched endlessly in every direction. Guard towers stood at the corners, manned by American soldiers who spent most of their time reading magazines and complaining about the heat. It did not look like a place of punishment. It looked like a place where someone might actually want to live. Werner and the other new arrivals were processed once again, photographed once again, assigned to barracks and given supplies: a toothbrush, soap, clean underwear, writing paper and envelopes so they could send letters home through the Red Cross. Then they were taken to the mess hall for their first meal on American soil. Werner would remember that meal for the rest of his life. The mess hall was a large building with rows of wooden tables and benches filled with prisoners who looked healthier and better fed than any German soldiers Werner had seen in years. The smell that hit him as he walked through the door was so overwhelming that he actually stopped moving, causing the man behind him to bump into his back. Fried chicken, fresh cornbread, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans cooked with bacon, peach cobbler for dessert. This could not be real. This had to be some kind of elaborate deception. Werner moved through the serving line in a daze, accepting portions that were piled onto his tray by American cooks, who seemed almost cheerful. He found a seat at one of the tables and stared at his food, unable to believe what he was seeing. A prisoner who had been at the camp for several months sat down across from him. The man was from Hamburg, like Werner, and he must have recognized the look of shock on the newcomer's face. "I know," the man said. "I did not believe it either at first. I thought they were poisoning us. I waited 3 days before I would eat anything." Werner looked up. "And now I have gained 15 pounds, and I am learning to play baseball." The man smiled and took a bite of chicken. Werner looked down at his own tray. The food was still there, still real, still waiting. He picked up his fork and began to eat. The chicken was crispy on the